Joined now by Stanley McChrystal, who retired in 2010 as a 4-star general in the U.S. Army. I can't read all of his postings, not even close, but at his height, he oversaw the United States military effort in Afghanistan. He has since gone on to a life of consulting, reflection, teaching, and writing, a lot of writing, and also a lot of reading. His latest work is called On Character, Choices That Define a Life. General Stanley McChrystal, welcome to The Gist.
Thanks, Mike. It's an honor to be here.
So, as cliche as it is, I'm going to start right on page 2, where you define character. The cliche isn't your definition. It's just to start right with the thesis. But I think we have to, because it was interesting to me. Character you define as convictions times discipline. So first of all, the equation, it could have been plus. Why times?
Well, because if either is 0, then in fact, I think the resulting product is 0. So if a person has no convictions or lacks the discipline to live to them, you end up with no character.
I hadn't even thought of it that way. That is true. I was also thinking that there's a multiplier effect with each. If one is 1 or very low, you don't really get elevated to what we would call someone of good character or high character. They feed upon each other.
Well, they definitely do. And if you go to convictions, because we really haven't talked about that yet, your deeply held beliefs, the downside is you can have bad convictions. You can have values that are absolutely corrupt and then be very disciplined in pursuing them. Think Adolf Hitler. Think someone that we think of as evil. In one way, you could argue they have character. It's just of a negative sort. And then there are other people that I think they're an empty vessel.
Yes. So that's the one that was interesting to me, and I'm seeing the appeal of it more and more in society. So I think we all understand what are convictions without discipline. It's someone who perhaps has strong beliefs or says they have strong beliefs, but they don't do anything to put it into practice in real life. That is very easy to understand. But I think I'm seeing more of the kind of character who has a lot of discipline. He'll post something on Instagram and there'll be a 4-hour routine and he'll put on a Breathe Right nasal strip and dunk his face in ice water or any other manner of I'm working out really hard or I'm doing the grind to make a lot of money. And this kind of person, I do think more and more has been elevated by society as someone to look up to. I wonder if that's what you see as a person with discipline but without character, and if you think that this more and more is becoming attractive, especially to younger people.
Well, it's an interesting observation. I see it somewhat differently. The person who gets up 4 a.m. to have their hair done so they look a certain way, they present something, that is a form of discipline, no doubt about it. But the discipline that I'm talking about goes back to convictions and values. If you are raised believing in integrity, if you are raised in believing in equity, fairness, and then even though you are willing to get up every morning at 4 o'clock to get your hair done or do any of those things that allow you to carry on actions, but you are willing to depart from your convictions. You are willing to step away from your idea of what right and wrong is. If you are willing to abandon what you think is fairness because opportunistically that's in your advantage, I would argue they don't really have discipline. They've got this sort of energetic ability to function, but it is not moored to serious convictions.
Yeah, it wouldn't lead to character. I think that vanity plays a large part of that. Do you think that the physical necessity of soldiering, of being in the military, is almost a cheat code for achieving character? Because you have to, or when the military engages in training, they have to emphasize the physical. And as a result, discipline is almost built into the process of creating a soldier, airman, Marine, sailor.
I think it's helpful. I think that when you enter the service, you're given a number of values as well as a number of new behaviors. They take away your name, they cut your hair off, they give you new clothes, they give you a new identity, and they offer a set of service-related values which are wrapped in patriotism. And I think those start a habit of behaviors that are very positive. They don't give you solid character, because I knew too many military leaders and military members who could do all of those external actions of being a soldier, but when you actually got down to real character, how they treated people, their difficult decisions in moments of stress, that they were not reflective of what I would consider strong character. But again, they are helpful. Anything that starts the habit of living to norms and values, I think, is something that helps.
Right. And again, and this is something you said in the beginning, since there's such great subjectivity as to what those norms or values are, and you've said this in the book, that someone who lived a life as you did and the best soldiers under you did aren't that dissimilar than someone who lived a life in a religious community, even an Islamic community in Afghanistan, and has dedicated themselves to killing Americans. There's more overlap than we might think.
Yeah, and you're pulling at something that I relate in the book. Members of Congress and other visitors would come to Iraq at the height of the war against al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they would be very impressed with my forces. And then they would say, "Are you killing those evil bastards on the other side?" And I would go to a whiteboard and I would draw a line, and I'd put on one end our force and on one end the best al-Qaeda terrorists. And then I would erase it and I would change it with a curved line that curved up with the two arrows just about pointing at the top. And I said, the reality is the best of my people are very similar to the best of their people. They are very loyal. They are team-oriented. They're very personally disciplined. They support a cause, and so do all of theirs. The difference is what they were subjected to during their life's journey, the values they were offered either through religion or family or society. And so you find yourself sometimes actually admiring the people you are killing and not admiring some of the people that you are serving for.
This has always been true in war, right? It's why Richard the Lionhearted saw in Saladin a figure of respect. Lee and Grant, that's maybe even too simple. They, went to the same military academy, didn't they? But soldiers, the Christmas truce in World War I, they would always look across the battlefield and see a kinship quite often.
Well, that's right, because you also see it up close. You see the sacrifice they're making. You see the privation they may be suffering, and you feel that in your own world. And so you say, except for the cause, they are people that I feel are good people.
When a politician would come and visit you in a war zone, would you be able to draw that curve where the best of the military curved and met the best of politician, or were they, in general, a different breed of cat?
They were a very different breed of cat. There were people who were just as good as any people that I had, but many of them had just a different frame of reference, the way they thought and the things that, the incentives in their lifestyle, in the world that they were living in, the political thing, were so different from ours that sometimes you found there was a pretty significant gulf.
Does that mean they have poor character, or is there something that selects for one mission, which is yours in Iraq or Afghanistan, and then some other personality traits or incentives that selects for their mission? Maybe their mission, you wouldn't call it the same kind of character that you're looking for in your soldiers, but maybe their mission is best served by their makeup.
Yeah, and this is something that's complex, and so I'll describe it. If you take someone in the military, we reward a certain kind of behaviors and values. It's pretty stoic. People would say it's inflexible. I think that's probably oversimplified. But then you go into politics, for example, and if somebody enters politics, they enter an environment to which they must adapt. I have a lot of young people come to me now and they say, I'm thinking about running for Congress. And I always give them an answer that says, I think you'd be great in Congress and you're the kind of person that I want there, but you are probably going to become something that I will mourn seeing you become, because you will adapt to the environment you're in. Necessarily, you will start to act and do things that are required in that particular ecosystem. And I think we see that pretty broadly. And I think most of the people who enter politics enter with really good intentions. And then as we see down the line, many of them start to say things that are just sort of irritatingly self-promotional, or they'll say things that you don't believe they think are true, or they're certainly so different from what they said a few years before that it doesn't seem true. And on the one hand, I want to damn them all. But on the other hand, anyone who goes into that environment and survives, that may be the cost of doing it. And so I'm conflicted on my opinion. If you ask me on Monday, I will be disdainful of all of them. If you ask me on Tuesday, I'll be more understanding, and then I circle back on Wednesday.
I want to break down that strategy. And first of all, it's you telling the aspirant that, probably take it on face value, you believe it. But also there is a strategy there. You're a general, you understand tactics. I would assume that what you're trying to do is, this is the kind of person who comes to you, General Stanley McChrystal, for your advice and approval. So it's a certain kind of person, and which means that at least at this point in your lives, you have some common ground. You're trying to plant a seed. You're trying to perhaps say, don't let this happen to you because I've seen it so often. And I don't know what the track record has been or if many of those people have gone on to Congress, but it reminds me of that story that I once heard you tell about when you were either a first or second year, and I'm going to get the terms wrong, plebe at West Point, and a new commander came in and gave you some advice and gave you some encouragement. But I also thought that there were some tactics there to try to get, not just to give advice, but to get the best out of you. So two-part question. Does it remind you of that? And are there some tactics going on when you give that advice?
Yeah, of course. Anyone who comes to me for advice, I try to take the advantage of influencing them. To go back to your story, that was 1974. I was just finished my second year at West Point, and I'd been very unsuccessful my first 2 years. I'd almost been thrown out for academics and behavior. We had a new tactical officer come in, a guy named Dave Barato, a special forces officer, and he sat me down, and I'm sitting across the desk from him, and he goes, it was the new tactical officer having one-on-ones with all the cadets he was going to be in charge of. And he goes, I think you're going to be a great cadet, and I think you're going to be an even better Army officer. And I remember I almost tried to lean over the desk to see if he's looking at the wrong file. Because I actually did say, do you know who you're talking to? This is Stan McChrystal. I haven't done too well. He says, yeah, but the stuff you haven't done well at is stuff that doesn't matter in the Army. The stuff I see in your file that tells me you're going to be a good soldier is right here. I think you're going to be a great soldier. And of course, my last 2 years at West Point, I did much better, partly because of his leadership, partly because I started dating who is now my wife. But I do think when I give that challenge to people who want to go into politics, what I'm basically trying to do is trying to get them to not be what most people become. Sometimes it works, and I'm sure it doesn't work all the time.
I want to ask you, let me go back, something you said. Why does West Point load up their students and soldiers with a bunch of stuff that doesn't correlate to being a successful soldier? That seems like not optimal.
Yeah, West Point was founded as an engineering school because in 1802, that was the difference between a very professional military and another. So we were very engineering focused. And then they decided that engineering was great problem solving. And I can't be sure whether it is. I am trained as an engineer. I'm not a very good one. But the reality is they also did a lot of what I'll call petty things when I was at West Point, hazing and whatnot. There is great value in discipline, and there's great value sometimes in very harsh discipline, but there's never any value in jackassery. There's never any value in that. And I think that tradition had grown at West Point. I think it's mostly died out, but old things die hard.
Yeah. And of course, the definition of what it means to be a great soldier always changes, not even as wars change. I remember reading biographies of Grant, and they had to draw horses back when he went, right?
Right.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. You had to draw a horse. So you have a chapter on quitting, and the subtitle is Abandoning Things We've Committed to is a Dangerous Habit. But a friend of mine and professional poker player, Annie Duke, has written a whole book on quitting, and it's kind of counterintuitive. And she frames quitting as a decision skill it's worth getting good at. She says to recognize the sunken cost fallacy. She says that when you quit successfully, it speeds up progress to allow you to free up resources that can be devoted to more promising things. So I understand if you're in the middle of Ranger training school and half the people drop out, and it's a pretty direct line from here you are to here's the end of school, and you're gonna have to tough it out if you can. That's one set of decisions, but for most of us in the rest of life, I tend to think more like Annie does, and I even wonder if quitting has gotten too bad a name. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a great admirer of Annie's. I love her books. And I think she's right on this. But let's make sure we understand what she's saying. She is saying to take into account the probabilities of the outcomes when you make a decision to quit. And I think most of the decisions we make in life, particularly the ones I'm referring to, we are deciding to quit, not because probability of outcome, but because it's hard, or because it's uncomfortable, or because we're scared, any number of reasons. And we need to understand that unlike a poker table, where if you fold a hand and walk away from something, there's not a lingering impact to that. If you walk away from a commitment, if you walk away from a marriage with children, if you walk away from allies in a war, if you walk away from business partners, there is a scar tissue left, both on the people you walk away from, and I would argue on ourselves. And so I think the habit of quitting, in my view, becomes too much seen through a very, very narrow lens. I want to quit because I just want to stop doing this, and not because we've really thought through the outcome.
Do you think the ethos of the military, however, is more resistant or hostile to quitting than it always should be? I mean, you, in the McChrystal group, you have clients in the tech sector. Quitting there, if you quit at the right time, you've made $1 billion. So there's a lot of quitting going on. But when I think about the military, quitting has certainly a negative sheen, and it correlates to failure or a failed mission. And I wonder if that's a problem the military needs to grapple with.
The answer is yes and no. And so from the standpoint of you want the military, once you unleash them, to be focused and not be willing to walk away, almost like a dog in a fight. You've got a dog in a fight and you want them to be completely focused on winning, and that's what you want the military to do. This is the importance of civilian leadership over the military. The reality is, if you put the military in a war, they're going to try to win, and they're not going to stop until somebody tells them to stop. And they run into the risk of not being able to say, hey, this isn't going well, we're not likely to win, this is a bad outcome, because it's not in the DNA. This is where the partnership with the civilian leadership must be able to understand. It's like a baseball pitcher. I used to pitch in high school. If the coach comes to you in the 7th or 8th inning and you're not throwing as well as you were earlier and says, how do you feel? I expect that pitcher to say, I'm good, I can keep going. Any pitcher that doesn't say that, I don't want to play with. But right. I expect the coach to say, nope, you've been doing pretty well. Take a seat if that's the right answer. And that's the way I think it is with the military. The key is the military's got to understand that about themselves. They've got to be honest enough to know. And I can look at my own experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. And once given the mission, I became focused on the mission, and I was no longer detached enough to provide perfectly unbiased assessment of where we were and whether we were likely to succeed.
Did you realize that at the time?
I did. And because, I wasn't a historian, but I was an enthusiast of history. So I'd read about previous wars, particularly Vietnam, where my brother and father served. And so I was very attuned to that reality. But when you're up close to it and you've been given a mission, it's really hard to say, I know you've told me to do this, but I'm telling you, we can't or shouldn't.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the end of your military career, because you write about it and talk about it more in other books, but you write about it here. And I just wanted, for the real question I want to ask, I need to know, when you look at, so listeners should know or remember that General McChrystal made intemperate remarks to Rolling Stone magazine, and it was a national story of the day. He's called into President Obama's office because, and I want to know how you think of it. Do you think that the president had no choice but to accept your resignation? Do you think that there was any way out of that, or did you put him in an impossible situation?
Yeah, to clarify the story, it was about me and my staff, and the author said that my staff was making intemperate remarks and whatnot. Right. And I don't know the degree it was accurate or anything like that, and I didn't have time or the interest in going to do it. I offered my resignation to the president. In my view, I had failed. I had failed because a commander on the battlefield is not supposed to put difficult crises on the president's desk. And so when I went to see President Obama, that's what I told him. I said, I should not do that to you. I should not put you in this position. Therefore, if you want to accept my resignation, that's fine. If you want me to go back out and continue to serve, I will. I think in the moment, I think he had a choice. I don't think he thought he had a choice, and that's fair on his part. There was a lot of civ military pressure, and there were a lot of pundits writing about it. And so I think it put him in a position where it looked as though there was this storyline by some people said that the military were trying to pressure this new president. That wasn't true. But I can understand he was put in that position. And so I don't regret or resent the decision that he made. I understand it. I wish it had been different, but I respect it. Yeah.
And by the way, in the 15 years since, have you ever had occasion to talk to him about it or anything else of substance?
Yeah, we have. I worked on national service and also some things on veterans events with President Obama, and we've still got a good relationship. So I respected him before that. I respect him now. So.
Okay. So this is to ask a couple questions. One is, in the book, you talk about, this affected me because I went through something like this. This is right after you were in the news for this. Having recently appeared on television, I was recognizable to many people. Walking through airports, I'd see strangers point me out to those they were with, and I'd assume they were saying derogatory things about me. Of course, I couldn't know that, but I believed the worst. As time passed, though, more people stopped to say kind things. I realized my assumptions had never been correct. So I went through something like this, and I assumed I would many of us probably have, and I interpreted ambiguity always in the negative and reflected it and it reflected poorly upon me, I assumed. And then the more I found out, often I would find out that wasn't the case. But why I'm asking you is, you strike me as someone who is not beset by self-doubt, quite the opposite, quite confident, understands himself, thinks about metacognition and character. If this happened to you, doesn't it tell you something unbelievably powerful about, well, the tribal nature of our species, but also how attuned we are, and this is true for leaders and soldiers and generals, how attuned we are to the approval of others? It's just such an I think it's such an unbelievable motivating force, and I don't know what to do with it except to realize how powerful it is.
Yeah, and first I would say that I've got a lot more insecurities than you give me credit for. So as I went through that, I think I feel it like anybody else. As you go up in a career, no matter what you're doing, and you become more reinforced by success, it is more surprising when suddenly you have this failure and you suddenly find your insecurities sort of laid bare again. And so the thing I tell people is when they're in this situation, there are two realities. The first is you're always thinking the worst. And then the second is you assume people are thinking about your problem. And the reality is after the news cycle, about 48 hours, they're not. They have moved on. So I would meet people sometime after and I would think, here I am, disgraced general, this kind of stuff. And they'd go, you were in the Army, I think. And you realize that the only person who is obsessed about your issue is you.
Yeah. If I had assigned you, commissioned you to write a book about character at that point in your life, all right, give it a few months, not exactly in the middle of the maelstrom, how would your book on character have been different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it would have been more focused on sort of a traditional study of character. You know, you've got to be thrifty, brave, clean, reverent, all, whatever those list of things that we tend to say are character, almost like a leadership book or a treatise on what's a good character and what's a bad character. In the 15 years since I've left the military, I think it's gotten much more nuanced, a lot of time to think about it. And I started this book just as a series of thoughts. And I found that they intersected at character because that's what I've come to conclude is the most effective thing. But I think that character is reflected in a lot of subtle ways. It's reflected in your relationship with your family. It's reflected in how you think about big issues in society, equity, civil rights, whatever. I think all of those things are part of this puzzle that is your character. I don't think your character is one small contained entity.
Did you think that you'd see a massive land war in Europe in your lifetime?
No, in fact, with The End of History, written by Francis Fukuyama in 1989, I think we all said that there would not be a massive land war anywhere. Now, we then had the first Gulf War soon after that, but the reality was the idea that no two countries with McDonald's would ever go to war. You remember all the things we went through.
Yeah. The Golden Arches theory. Yes. I think it was when the Russians rolled into Georgia that one was put to rest. But so the military still had to plan. The military still had to not just plan, but procure arms. At the time, was your attitude, well, this is still proper. It could happen. You know, there's not a non-zero chance. Or was your attitude, I don't know why we're wasting money on this?
No, my attitude was we needed to arm for it to make sure it didn't happen. You need to raise the cost for your adversary to the point it's not worth it.
I listened to a podcast that you did, and there were a couple chapters just on DEI, on how DEI helps the military and helps organizations. Now that DEI has been swept out of the military and other forms of other federal government agencies, is it a big setback for the military?
I don't know yet. The reality is, I think DEI, if you take away the verbiage around it, DEI or wokeism or whatever, and you just get back to we are going to try to field the best military we can with the best people, that will usually mean we'll go get the best talent, and that will go across gender, it'll go across race, it'll go across different backgrounds. It will become a meritocracy. Not in maybe the old idea of a meritocracy, but actually what made a difference. I commanded the counterterrorist forces for 5 years, and traditionally that was sort of a white male, big bicep society. And really that held true until after 2001. And then we got in the fight, particularly in Iraq in 2003, and it got really hard. It was interesting. We became a meritocracy by necessity. We started having females in positions that you wouldn't expect. There's a female that worked for me then who's commanding an infantry division in the United States Army now. When I was young, people would have laughed at the idea, but she is a great officer. And so I think that when you really need performance, I think those requirements become obvious, and you can't maintain some of the old biases.
Well, is that an argument for or against this apparatus or the imposition of a DEI mindset or rules? I mean, what you just described is out of necessity, out of the Army, out of the military being the best military it can, it evolves to be more open and less bulging bicep white and male.
Yeah, I think it needs help, so I argue for it. If you go back to 1948 when President Truman said that the U.S. Army would be integrated, it actually took 6 more years before the military actually complied with that. If we think of all of the big changes socially in our society, either for females or minorities or whatever, if we let them just apply themselves naturally, they don't make the progress they need. It's glacial. So I think that it was important in the military that we give opportunities to females, opportunities to minorities. Sometimes that means quotas. Sometimes that means changing some standards, because you're trying to create a ladder for future generations. When I was young, females were allowed to be officers in the Army, but they couldn't be in combat arms, and they couldn't do a certain number of jobs. And so when it came time to select general officers, they weren't competitive. They may have been made colonel, but they didn't have the record to be competitive. And so you could look at them with a straight face and say, we're picking the best people for the job. But they had never been given the opportunity. Once we gave them the opportunity, it changed. And I think that's true of other minorities as well.
When you interact with top military leaders of foreign governments, do they select for the same characteristics in their generals, admirals, and top leaders as the United States does?
I think it varies just very broadly. In the most professional militaries, they have a system where you go through a series of educational steps and assignments, and they do. In too many areas, there is a political side to it, or there's a nepotism part, and militaries which are more tainted by either the politics or the culture of society, in my view, are significantly weaker because they've allowed certain requirements of religion or politics and all to affect who's selected.
Can anything be done to break down the civilian-military gap, the ever-widening gap, anything short of a draft?
I am a believer in civilian national service. I think every young American should do at least 1 year of paid national service, partially because it just forces people to interact for a period of their lives. I think that would help. This is sacrilege, and I'll get in trouble for this, but I would do away with West Point, the Naval Academy, and the Air Force Academy as service academies. I would have all of those institutions still open, but they would all be for all the services, and they would be for the CIA, State Department, and whatnot. And so this entire year group of young people would go to one of these, and then they would go out and they would go to whatever form of service they want for the government. They would know each other from college. They would have been to each other's weddings. There would be connections, shared experiences. Right now, many military officers and civilian leaders meet for the first time, literally, when they're pretty senior and they're formed, and they've come up in their own silo. So I think it would do us good to integrate earlier.
Last thing I want to do, I know from the book, I know from listening to you talk, question that you like least is, hey, what should we have done in Afghanistan? You do say there's no avoiding us getting into Afghanistan. So I'm not going to ask you to come to a conclusion, but since I have you, I just want to ask you a couple questions that I've always thought about. And so this is to help me come to the conclusion I already have. Tell me if there are any flaws in my reasoning. The first factor is that before the and let's also stipulate, obviously the withdrawal went quite terribly. The first factor is before the withdrawal, I believe it was the withdrawal was in August, and it was February of the year before that there was a death of a serviceman in Afghanistan. So it's about a year and a half. So do I have that about right from what you recall?
You do.
Yeah. So we've gone about a year and a half. The second factor is or politicians, or the label forever war got applied to it, but I'm sure you've been to Landstuhl. I spent some time teaching at an army base in South Korea. There are many, many places where the United States military has been for much, much longer than Afghanistan. Or maybe you will say it's not quite fair to compare what was going on even in the last years of Afghanistan to South Korea. What would you say about that?
Well, I'm going to give you a biased response because obviously my involvement of Afghanistan. As you know, the Doha Accords were signed about 18 months before the final. Once they were signed, the deal was that the Taliban wouldn't attack Americans because we had said we were leaving. And so they didn't want to do anything to stop us from leaving. So at that point, it was a done deal. Now, the actual execution certainly went painfully. I personally believe that we went to Afghanistan after 2001 for our own interests. We were trying to get al-Qaeda out of there. We went into a country that was already ravaged by 2 decades of first war against the Soviets, then civil war. And so we're in this place, and it almost became a moral requirement for the West to see if we could help them put this back together again. So we started the effort to do that. We didn't do it really well. In fact, for the first 8 or 9 years, it was pretty half-hearted, to be honest. We were distracted by other things. I do think that we could have left a residual force. And I think a residual force of not that many people, maybe just at Bagram, could have given enough confidence to the Afghan military and to the Afghan government that they could have continued their progress. Now, I'm not an apologist for the Afghans because they had 20 years of help and they didn't make the most of it. But the reality is, in terms of national interests, I think us maintaining a base there and connections in the region would have paid off, similar to as you describe our people in South Korea, Japan, or Germany after the Second World War.
How big would the base have been?
I think you probably need several thousand people, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 total people, and they could reach out into the country. But I don't think you needed more than that.
The military will accept their assignment, but how would you characterize it as someone who was right there? Was the military at the breaking point where families, not in terms of losing a war, just in terms of frustration, not wanting to commit to this any longer? Or was it more like the military will accept their assignment and this can be done?
Yeah, I'll give you the answer I gave to a visiting congressional member back in Iraq. My force had been in tough combat for years, and she asked me, how long can they keep it up? And I said, they can keep it up until they think you're not serious, you're not committed. Once they think you're not, it's over. And so I think that once the American people signal that they don't care about an outcome or stability in Afghanistan, then leaving any forces is problematic because then people think that there's no point. A small force like that, I think, could be there indefinitely.
But what gets the American people to believe in that? Phrases like forever wars and discussion of it that doesn't take into account we hadn't even had a fatality there in a year and a half. Those are factors that would influence the American public's opinion, right?
They would. And we go back to our earlier conversation. We've gotten good at quitting.
Mm-hmm. Stanley McChrystal, retired General Stanley McChrystal, is the author newly of On Character, Choices That Define a Life. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike.